As students across Texas go back to school, lawmakers head to the Capitol to do some studying of their own. They're weighing plans to let parents use public money to pay for private school. We look at how lessons from smaller states could bring big changes for schools in Texas.
Bring me the children!
A rush to act after an agonizing delay. A court order releases hours of video showing the response to the Uvalde School Shooting. We go in depth with the state lawmaker about what the release means for accountability after the failures that day. Democrats are counting on Kamala Harris to bring new energy to boost their chances in November. But will it be enough to turn Texas into a campaign battleground? Why one leader is raising hope despite a lot of skepticism.
Produced from the Capitol in Austin and airing statewide, this is the award-winning State of Texas.
Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Hinkle. The House Committee on Public Education gave a preview of what will likely be a dominant issue next session. We're talking about education savings accounts, or ESAs. Will Dupree reports on the plans taking shape to let parents use public dollars to pay for private school.
All right, members, we're going to move on to charge number 2, educational opportunity.
State Representative Brad Buckley kicked off a brainstorming session about how Texas could craft a policy that has eluded top Republican leaders. The House Public Education Committee heard how some of these highlighted states are implementing education savings accounts. For instance, Indiana's program provides up to $20,000 for students with disabilities and their siblings who fall within a certain income level.
ESA grant must be used on private school tuition, curriculum, services, therapies, transportation, training programs and camps, and assessments.
Jonathan Covey with the conservative advocacy group Texas Values hopes state lawmakers will think broadly.
We support universal school choice. We also support some sort of prioritization method so that low income and vulnerable demographics can get what they need.
Democrats accuse the state's Republican leaders of saving a $32 billion surplus to pay for a voucher-like program.
I think is really disappointing considering, again, how substantially underfunded our neighborhood public schools are.
Some parents argue state leaders should work to shore up public schools.
We think vouchers are a conversation that would be way down the road. We have a lot of things in our public school system that needs support.
And I think if those schools were actually funded well, that parents wouldn't need to go elsewhere.
What shape the lawmakers' plan takes may not become clearer until after the November election. Will Dupree, State of Texas.
Last year, Democrats, along with a group of mostly rural Republicans in the Texas House, repeatedly helped block ESAs from becoming state law. Governor Abbott backed challengers who defeated many of those incumbent House members from his own party. Abbott now claims he has the support he needs to pass what he calls school choice next year. Also at Monday's hearing, the head of the Texas Education Agency told lawmakers student enrollment growth is expected to slow to zero over the next 5 years.
There's some school districts that have had declining enrollment for a number of years, some school districts that have been fast growth for a number of years, some school districts that have been relatively stable. But the state as a whole is tilting to no student enrollment growth.
Student enrollment is a key factor in funding for public schools. Texas Education Commissioner Mike Morath also testified that school districts spend about $1.7 billion more on special education than they receive in state funding. Morath says this and the demand on districts to have an armed officer at every campus might push lawmakers to revisit school funding during the next session. Commissioner Morath took several questions about religious content in new state-approved instructional materials. State Representative James Tallarico asked about materials aimed at elementary students that reference the resurrection of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount. He believes the lessons could cross a line.
The reason I'm asking is, as you know, Commissioner, I'm a former Texas public school teacher. I'm also a student at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And so I can tell you there is a difference between teaching and preaching. And in my opinion, these passages, which appear at length throughout the curriculum, I'm surprised you don't know about them, in my reading, they are preaching.
Tallarico raised concerns that the material could be unconstitutional, in part because other major religions did not get similar coverage. Supporters of the curriculum point to the importance of Christianity in the country's history. They also note that the materials are optional at this time. The House Public Education Committee met over 2 days last week. On the second day of hearings, members looked into what's causing schools to hire more teachers without proper credentials. The most recent numbers shared by the Texas Education Agency from last school year show more than 16,000 new hires had no Texas certification or permit. The state reported that made up almost a third of last year's new hires, and it could be hurting Texas students. Research from Texas Tech found students taught by uncertified teachers with no classroom experience lost 3 to 4 months of learning in reading and math. Plus, a University of Texas study found those faculty members are less likely to stick with teaching long term.
It's like a leaking bucket, pouring water out of it. You can't pour new water in it fast enough. We can't make teachers fast enough to deal with that exodus until we respond differently to how we support new teachers when they enter this most a critical profession.
Lawmakers on the committee had different ideas for how to make improvements. Democrats reiterated their calls for increasing teacher pay.
It's important that people feel like they are treated like professionals and they're paid like professionals.
Meanwhile, some Republicans suggest the best way forward might be to make the path to certification easier.
From my side, I want to minimize the hurdles of getting good teachers in the classroom, but I'm not saying absolutely no standard.
The search for solutions included calls for improved mentorship opportunities and incentivizing high-quality certification programs, ideas that could make their way into legislation in the upcoming session. For perspective, 2 years ago, the Texas Education Agency created a teacher vacancy task force to address staffing shortages. The task force focused on opportunities for certification, placement, and hiring flexibility. The task force issued its final report in 2023, which included calls for higher pay and better training. Funding for those plans stalled last legislative session amid the fight over education savings accounts.
Gunfire at last year's state fair sent crowds scrambling for safety. The shooting led the fair to put in a new policy to ban firearms. But find out how the state's trying to block that plan. Plus, Texas pushes back on federal rules to improve staffing at nursing homes. The reasons why the state claims the regulations go too far. A huge release of recordings highlights failures in the response to the Uvalde school shooting. But will it lead to accountability? We speak to a lawmaker to learn more about what comes next.
Gunfire at last year's state fair left 3 people wounded and sent crowds of fairgoers scrambling for safety. The shooting led the fair to put in a new policy to ban firearms. Now there's backlash. The Texas Attorney General is threatening legal action to overturn the policy before the fair opens next month in Dallas. Ryan Chandler looks closer at the controversy.
The fair under fire.
Know that the measures we take are to protect everyone.
But top Republicans say their ban on firearms is illegal. Attorney General Ken Paxton Wednesday threatening to sue the city of Dallas if they don't force the fair to change course. Some legislators call it un-Texan.
It's not very Texan to walk under big techs and say, no, the Second Amendment's not welcome here at the state fair, right?
It's a legal debate between gun rights and property rights. The fair is operated by a private entity, not the city of Dallas. But Dallas leases the park to the fair, and state law prohibits firearm bans on government land.
Clearly, they're in violation of the law. Their contention is baseless.
But the fair has dealt with gun violence in the past. Last year, 3 people were injured in this shooting when a man without a license to carry opened fire.
We need to pass common sense gun laws because the real threat to safety is an abundance of unregulated firearms in public. We need to prioritize the safety of people. And it looks like the state fair took that into consideration with this decision.
The fair has stood by their policy. They tell us they stand ready to cooperate with the city of Dallas as needed. And they say they'll have more than 200 police officers and safety team members on scene this year. Paxton says Dallas has 15 days to make the fair change course, or he'll see them in court. Ryan Chandler, State of Texas.
Also last week, Paxton announced a lawsuit against the federal government over a new rule affecting nursing homes. He argues the rule, which would create minimum staffing standards in these homes, violates the law. Earlier this year, the Biden administration finalized a rule requiring any skilled nursing facility that receives federal funding to offer a certain number of hours of care to each resident every day. It also requires every facility to have a registered nurse on site 24/7. The AG's lawsuit claims this rule violates what's called the Major Questions Doctrine, which says if a government agency tries to make a decision on an issue of major national significance, its actions must be supported by clear congressional authorization. Paxton says the staffing rule could cause some facilities to have to shut down, especially in rural areas. Supporters of the rule have said it could lead to better quality care and safety for nursing home residents.
Gunfire, agonizing calls for help, images of inaction. Recordings from the response to the Uvalde school shooting made public for the first time. We go in depth with a state lawmaker about how the release could affect the push for accountability and the work still to be done. And excitement for Kamala Harris has some Democrats thinking Texas is in play in November. Republicans and recent history paint a different picture though. We look closer at the chances coming up.
Bring me the children! Where's the suspect? Where's the suspect? Where's the suspect?
Video shows the moments officers took down the shooter at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. It's one clip from a large collection of recordings released after a lawsuit from news organizations. The records released include documents, text messages, and police body camera video. They provide a little more insight into the delayed law enforcement response to the shooting. They also released 911 calls, including one from the uncle of the shooter and another from a child inside the classroom.
There's a school shooting. Please hurry. There's a lot of dead bodies. Please. One of my teachers are dead.
The release of the recordings comes as the former Uvalde School District police chief faces criminal charges for his response to the shooting. Pete Arredondo pleaded not guilty to 10 counts tied to the failed response. Joining us now for Insight is State Senator Roland Gutierrez. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
Your district includes Uvalde, and you've been in touch with families affected by the shooting. What are you hearing from them after the release of these videos?
Well, they're all very disturbed and very disappointed. You know, you're supposed to rely on government. Government has failed the city of Uvalde and the community of Uvalde even before this horrible tragedy, and it continues to do so still. You have a district attorney who has failed to do an adequate investigation in this case. We're starting to see these new videos leak out that haven't even come to her desk, so who knows what kind of smoking gun there may or may not be in those videos. But, you know, they've had so many questions. Why not indict Ryan Kendall, the state Texas Ranger that walked around seemingly taking orders from someone on the phone, doing nothing? Why not indict Mariano Vargas, the chief of police, who got the call that there was children inside of that building and stood around and did nothing, walked around dazed and confused after he heard that? It seems to me that we've got a prosecutor that, yes, certainly has picked out 2 people to go after, but so many other cops can also be indicted, and that yet has not happened.
You have obviously talked a lot about the lack of that accountability in the aftermath of this shooting. Does the release of this video even make a difference to you?
There has been no real accountability from the Department of Public Safety. There's been no accountability from the governor's office. There's been no request for Steve McCraw to resign. Steve McCraw has rehired. Quite frankly, they never fired anybody. What happened here was a travesty of justice, a horrific crime, and what followed is a travesty of justice that we're living in.
I know you've seen a lot of these videos already. You've also seen some images that have not been made public. Are there things that haven't been released that people should see?
Well, I don't know if they should see them or not. There was images I can't take out of my mind. A little girl with her face just shot off entirely. And I don't think that the public truly understands the damage that this kind of weapon does. It fires 3 times the speed of my 9mm. When it hits the body, this bullet creates this incredible damage and devastation. The images that I've seen, I'll never unsee. We have to do something in this space because the loose Republican gun laws that we have are killing our children throughout this nation. We've got to do something, and we've got to think really thoughtfully about it. We have to get rid of our passions about the love for this weapon and understand that we are killing our children.
You know, in that vein, we're just months away from the next legislative session, and families are still looking for answers. Is there anything happening right now at the Capitol to push for accountability?
The Republicans are not interested in even revisiting any issues of Uvalde. I will be front and center, continuing to talk about raising an age limit on access to an AR-15 to 21. Even though I believe we should have a national assault weapons ban, at least we should have responsibility in that space. Most Republican voters, about 70% of them, agree with me on this issue. I'll continue talking about red flag laws, because if you see a young man go into a gun shop for 3 days in a row, and it looks strange and act strange, I mean, there's something obviously wrong. That's a red flag. Somebody should have called the sheriff's office. We've got to be able to have common sense in this issue. Those kids weren't Democrats. Their parents were Democrats. They were Republicans. They were independents. They were human beings. And these poor children were struck down at the beginning of their lives. And all that potential and all that hope is gone. And we've seen this movie play out over and over across this state. When are we finally going to do something? So Republicans are going to continue to close their eyes to this. I'm going to continue to fight and push back.
Senator, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
You heard the senator mention the Texas Ranger Ryan Kendall. He was suspended amid an investigation into his response to the mass shooting. But earlier this month, DPS Director Stephen McCraw removed that suspension and allowed him to return to his position. That decision came after a Uvalde County grand jury determined Kendall did not break protocol or laws on the day of the shooting.
She's giving us that youthful energy, and she's giving us that something we can relate to, and I think that's what people want.
Kamala Harris boosting excitement and poll numbers. Some Democrats believe she could turn the tide in Texas. But could the state really be a battleground in November? We look closer at the chances. Democrats will meet in Chicago this week for their party convention. It comes after the shakeup that put Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, a change that's ramping up excitement for the party's chances around the country and raising hopes here in Texas. It's a long shot for Democrats to flip Texas. Republicans have won every statewide election here in the past 30 years, but one high-profile Democrat thinks this year could be different. Will Dupree reports on his claims going viral that Texas could be more competitive than ever.
Honestly, since this is my first time voting for president, it's meaningful, I guess.
The election this November is different for Caleb Brizuela. He finally gets to cast a ballot for president, and the 21-year-old says he's excited to support Kamala Harris.
Even though she may be older, she's giving us that youthful energy, and she's giving us that something we can relate to, and I think that's what people want.
He says his friends are now more engaged in the race too, and that enthusiasm could factor into how Democrats perform in Texas, according to this familiar voice.
I don't know, but I can tell you in Texas, which Barack Obama lost by 16 points in 2012, Hillary Clinton lost by 9 points in 2016, and Joe Biden only lost by 5.4% in 2020. This is really the sleeper battleground state.
That phrase, used by Beto O'Rourke, trended this week on social media. Republicans, though, question whether he's worth listening to still, since he lost 2 statewide races. And as James Henson with the Texas Politics Project points out,
this has been the dog that hasn't barked for a long time.
He says more would have to happen for Texas to become a true battleground.
Whether we've crossed the threshold that will attract effort, volunteers, enthusiasm, and maybe most importantly, money I think is still a little bit of an open question.
The race is now much more competitive than it was a month ago.
While that may be true, Travis County Republican Chairman Matt Makoviak expects Texas not to be in the small mix of states that will ultimately decide who sits in the White House.
And in the end, it might even be more simple than that. Whoever wins Pennsylvania will likely be the next president of the United States.
Will Dupree, State of Texas.
A poll released last week shows that the Harris campaign may be making headway in Texas. The poll is from the group ActiVote. It surveys voters using a free app that people can download. Using that method, ActiVote polled 400 likely Texas voters between June 25th and July 18th. That was before President Biden ended his re-election campaign, and the results showed Donald Trump leading by just under 9 percentage points. That's comparable to other polls in that same time period. After Harris got in the race, ActiVote did a new poll, same size, 400 likely voters, but a shorter time frame. This one covered just 2 weeks, ending on August 13th. The results showed a gain for Democrats, but that still gives Trump a 6.5-point lead over Harris. The margin of error in both polls is 4.9%. Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle, and we'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.